Well, good morning everyone and Happy New Year. It's great to be here in Riverhead with my friends and colleagues Shane Jones and Chris Pink. This is one of first of many announcements we'll be making this year about making it easier to get things done in New Zealand, and want to acknowledge Andrew and Rochelle for having us here at their beautiful minor residential unit, also known as a granny flat, here in Riverhead, where we've had a bit of a tour of this really nice 65 square metre property. Today, the government's changes to our granny flat rules come into effect, allowing New Zealanders to build up to 70 square metres granny flats without a resource consent or without a building consent. So those changes were announced initially in 2024. There was consultation in 2025, and they were gazetted at the tail end of last year, and they come into effect as of today. So from today, the new National Environmental Standard for detached minor residential units comes into effect, which means that people building granny flats or minor residential units up to 70 square metres will not need a resource consent as long as they comply with the rules set out within those standards. And the legislative effects that Parliament legislated last year to the Building Act come into effect, and the regulations underneath that as well, which means that as long as you use a licensed building practitioner and again follow the rules, a building consent is not required as well. And so those rules take effect today, and I think will be widely welcomed by people around the country. We expect many people to take up the opportunity of building a granny flat on their property. It's not the answer to our housing crisis in New Zealand. It's not the one answer. There is no one answer, but it is part of the solution in providing more options for people, more flexibility, more choices around people choose to live their lives. And I want to say again thank you to Andrew and Rochelle for having us here in their lovely house. Alongside the granny flat changes we're making, and I'll ask Shane and Chris to talk to them as well, it's also just worth noting that a whole suite of other changes to national direction under the RMA come into effect today. So in all, 10 new or changed pieces of national direction come into legal effect today. It's the biggest change to national direction in the RMA's history. It is worth noting, of course, that we are replacing the RMA with new legislation. That legislation is before Parliament. National direction exists now, and it will exist under the new legislation. National direction refers to the rules and policies and the frameworks that is set nationally by central government, that is required to be applied by councils and by decision makers under the legislative framework of the RMA now, but it will become the Planning Act and the Natural Environment Act. So today we are introducing into law for the first time in New Zealand history, for example, a national policy statement on infrastructure, which sends a clear message through the planning system that infrastructure is critical to New Zealand's future prosperity, that the days of years and years of projects being tied up in legal red tape are over, and that there needs to be a clear pathway for the roads, the rail, the ports, the infrastructure that New Zealand needs for the future. Also coming into effect today is a new or a revised national policy statement for renewable energy, which sends a very clear message that we need more wind farms, we need more solar generation, we need more hydro, we need more geothermal, and those things have been too hard to consent, and so the new national policy statement sends a clear message around that. Also coming into effect is a whole suite of changes to make it easier for mines and quarries in New Zealand. The simple reality is that we can't build the infrastructure we need and grow this economy without quarries and without mines, and there's a suite of changes to a variety of national instruments that will make it easier. There will be an easier pathway for the quarries and the mining projects that we need. So there are 10 changes in total. They send a clear message to the system that this government is about growth, about jobs, and about building the future for New Zealanders. I'm going to hand over to Shane to make a few remarks, and then Chris, and then we'll take some questions.
Thank you, Minister Bishop. I became a politician in 2005, and in 2006 the providers of accommodation for the RSZ workers in the Hawke's Bay came to see me that the RSC workers coming out of the Pacific were unable to find the necessary level of comfort by living in caravans. So we came up with the idea of a 10 square metre dwelling for the purposes of RSC. And 20 odd years later, with the assistance of the Minister of Building, Mr. Pink, we've been able to deliver on this key feature of the coalition agreement. But for me, Minister Bish, it's been a labour of love, because I see this after 20 years as an opportunity to offer more Kiwis the chance to own their own home, or for us to expand the availability of suitably sized dwellings, whether it's where I come from in the Taitokero on Māori land, or whether it's ancillary dwellings here in Auckland and other parts of New Zealand, freed of the hassle of red tape. So I really must acknowledge Minister Pink. He took the issue. He was far more thorough than Matua Jones would have been, but he delivered on behalf of our Cabinet and also with the leadership of Minister Bishop, because this was a key feature of what Winston Peters did put in. Rangi Tōpuni, as a part of the forest, is another development. So for those of you who live in this delightful area of Tāmaki Makaurau, next to the Riverhead Forest, bit by bit it will expand. But I'm hopeful it expands with better infrastructure, and we're not going to get better infrastructure unless we have an RMA and national policy statements that remind the planners and the regulators that the authority is vested in Parliament, with those of us who have a democratic mandate to reform and change the system. And I know for a lot of people the pace of reform has been awkward, but this is an election year, and it's a year that we're going to show that we have delivered. And in this small way, Minister Bishop, Mr. Pink, the granny flat option shows that we've delivered as a coalition government something that was directly referred to in our coalition agreement. And I only hope and pray that more Kiwis have a better option with housing. This is a delightful dwelling. And thank you to the owners for enabling us to turn up today. I arrived early and my wife was very embarrassed. She said, we're not going to someone's personal residence and an MP imposing himself. So then I waited for Chris Pink to impose himself upon you. But look, thank you for opening up your home. You've got a beautiful part of New Zealand that you live in here. And I only hope that today's announcement enriches the options for more and more Kiwis. I'll have more to say in respect of mining and quarrying at a later stage, but it's a pleasure to be here with my two colleagues. And this genuinely is, folks, for areas where I come from, a housing option. It's something we campaigned on, and I'm happy to stand with my colleagues and say that today we've delivered. Thank you very much.
Morena, good morning. Thanks for the opportunity to be with you here today. I'm delighted to be sharing this platform with my colleagues and friends, the Honourable Chris Bishop and the Honourable Shane Jones. The comments that they make around making it easier for infrastructure to be built are music to my ears as the local MP for this area. Kaipara Mahurangi, of which Riverhead is a part, desperately needs that. So it's the quarries within our area, but of course it's the roads and the other supporting infrastructure. In terms of the history of the Granny Flats, Mr Jones has quite rightly mentioned the principled advocacy that he personally and his party, New Zealand First, have brought to this particular issue. I'm grateful to have worked alongside Shane, as well as Chris, of course, in terms of the resource management side of the equation. I'll just briefly comment that the change that we're allowing in terms of these granny flats will affect a number of New Zealanders. In a rural context, it's worker accommodation, as Shane has again mentioned, particularly with that history through the RSE scheme. But of course, it's also younger New Zealanders. It might be students, might be older New Zealanders, as the name Granny Flat implies, or it might be other young New Zealanders, such as the current occupants. And I do want to acknowledge as well owner Leanne, thank you for allowing us to be here today. And then my final comment is just that this particular policy, which is coming to fruition today, connects to the broader program of work in the building and construction space. It's about taking a balanced and proportionate approach to risk. For example, as seen in our changes to the seismic risk settings with earthquake-prone buildings, which will be a boon here in Auckland and of course much further afield as well in cities and small towns alike, but more particularly in the area of what we call self-certification, allowing responsible builders and other tradespeople to get on and do the work for which they are qualified, for which they are licensed, and enabling them to certify that the requirements of the building code have been met, where there is a relatively simple design structure, a detached up to 70 square metre dwelling in the case of a granny flat, for example. So on that, I'm delighted to be here with Chris and Shane. Thank you for your interest in this, and there'll be many more occasions, I'm sure, to talk further about our work in building construction as well as resource management and infrastructure, as my colleagues and friends have done. So with that, I'll pass back to Chris Bishop, and I suspect the opportunity to...
Well, let's just open for questions.
A lot of changes coming in today, like you mentioned. Do you worry that there's a bit too much going on for councils and the public to keep up with?
Well, we've taken an ambitious approach. There's no doubt about that. But we've divided up the resource management reform program into phases deliberately. Phase 1 was getting rid of Labour's reforms, which we did. Phase 2 was fast track, which is now well in place and working really well. There will be some more projects consented, I'm sure, this year, many more. And then this program of national direction, which is, we started in 2024 and 5, and is now kind of coming to its end. And then the new bills and the national direction changes that we're implementing today will sequence into the new system. So we've done it in I think a relatively sophisticated way, and in a way that makes it as easy as possible for councils and for people in the system. But change is always difficult. On the other hand, change has been required because we can't have a planning system that gums up progress. As I think is now widely acknowledged, that the RMA has been the source of considerable difficulties for infrastructure, for housing, for renewable energy. It should not take years and years to consent wind farms. In a country with abundant wind and abundant renewable energy, it should not take that much time and money to consent basic energy and infrastructure. So that's why we're changing it.
And just on granny flats, there will be so many people out there who will be pleased with not having to get that resource consent. It just makes things simpler. Do we risk a dropping in standards?
Well, if you read the details carefully, there's a variety of rules in there around site to boundary coverage, around the area that you can use of the site, for example, around setback rules. So it's not a complete free for all. You can't just go and just build something out the back. You've got to follow the building code. You've got to follow the standards set out in the resource consents, and I think that's why we spent a bit of time consulting on it. I mean, there was a few people who said, I just ram it through, and we said, well, hang on a minute, we just got to make sure we get the nuances of this right. So there was quite widespread consultation with the building sector, with homeowners, with councils, and the consultation allowed us to make those rules in both the standard, the environmental standard, and the regulations and the legislation as well. So I think we've got the balance about right, and I think it will be widely welcomed by many people. In fact, I would get emails frequently from people saying, when is this coming into effect? Can you guys hurry up, please? And so, good news is, it comes into effect today.
What about flood zones? We're not far from Kumeu, which is,
Yep.
We're actually looking at management creek from that. So granny flats can be able to be built in areas prone to flooding?
So the short answer is no. So the same restrictions that apply to ordinary dwellings will apply to granny flats as well. Actually, one of the things that I didn't mention in my remarks up the top, one of the other things that comes into effect today is a new national policy statement on natural hazards, which is a layer of direction under the RMA, which sends a clear message to councils that they have to take a risk-based and proportionate-based approach to natural hazards, and they've got to map them, and they've got to identify them, and then work out where you can build and where you can't build. That has been one of the missing gaps in the system, is that councils have taken a frankly all over the show approach to it around the country. Some councils have been quite good at it, other councils have barely done anything. They've used different standards, they've used different rules around that, so we're now setting a clear national approach to the identification and the risk mitigation when it comes to natural hazards, and that will in time, this is going to be a long process, that will in time lead to the further identification of areas that are inappropriate for housing and where that won't happen.
So there is actually quite a big asterisk for anyone can build a granny flat, but there are some pretty major T's and C's attached.
Well, you can build a granny flat as long as you use a licensed building practitioner, and as long as it's up to 70 square metres and you follow the height to boundary ratios and the setback rules and all the rest of it. But it's like building anything, right?
So it's not like you're telling the public, yay, anyone can build a flat anywhere. There's actually like hey, you've actually just got to check.
Yes, you need, yes, there are rules and restrictions around it, but it is far more liberal, and the rules are far more liberal now than they are in most councils.
Yeah.
I might say with that.
Yeah, you add to that.
Yeah, thank you. If I can just add, the point about having a minor dwelling on an existing parcel of land that's already zoned for residential, and then at least in theory shouldn't be in a flood zone, is the first aspect. And that actually takes pressure off the need for large greenfields developments, such as we see in areas like northwest Auckland, for example. But also there's a bit of protection in the system whereby council need to be informed of the fact that a granny flat will be built. It's not an opportunity for them to say no, so it's not a consent per se, but it's an awareness on the part of the council of what is being built, and of course when the work's completed, afterwards it needs to be in the official council records so that it can be used for the purposes of rating and just general awareness, so that stormwater and other infrastructure that needs to support can be provided for over time.
Yeah, what pressure are you expecting that to put on councils and their water services?
Well, we think because the nature of it is it's pretty well dispersed, because it's one single granny flat per existing property on which there's a major dwelling, that it will be not a particularly large effect in any given place. Literally tapping into an existing infrastructure is part of the philosophy of the program. Of course, there's broader work that needs to be done and is being done in the planning space that Chris has alluded to and could speak to more, but certainly in terms of the granny flats, it's a balanced and proportionate approach, recognising that we do need to provide much more quickly and more affordably and with greater certainty the ability for people to provide this kind of accommodation for all the categories of New Zealanders who will benefit from that. And I will just add as well, for the construction sector, of course, following a tough few years and coming out of that now, it's a real boon to be able to move much more quickly and not be delayed. And with self-certification, as the angel in my ear has been whispering, that enables them to get on with it much more quickly as well. And of course we understand that time equals cost, which is ultimately passed on to Kiwis who just want a decent standard of living at a price that they can afford.
We've spoken to a builder who says that these changes won't really bring the cost of a granny flat down for people. You know, you've got soil, geotechnical reports, all that sort of stuff. You know, do you think these changes are enough of an incentive to get people to build granny flats?
Yeah, there's a variety of estimates out there. I mean, our numbers, from government indicate there will be saving of around $5,500 in direct costs and speeding up the process by around 14 weeks. So that will vary in different parts of the country, obviously. But there will be time and cost savings for New Zealanders as a result of these changes. I mean, as of now, you can now build an up to a 70 square metre granny flat on your property without having to go through the quite burdensome resource consent process and without having to go and get a building consent for that property. Now, there are some rules and regulations around that, so it's not a free-for-all, but just the removal of that layer of red tape will undoubtedly make a difference, both in terms of time and in terms of money. There's no doubt about that in my mind.
How far will this go then in terms of, trying to bring down that affordability crisis?
Well, ultimately, our housing crisis is the function of multiple failures across the housing system, and we have work underway across all of those issues to try and solve them. The most fundamental one is land supply. We are not a small country by land mass. We're the size of the United Kingdom. There's only 5 million of us, but we have created a planning system that has driven up the price of land and therefore driven up the price of housing. So we have work underway around freeing up our land supply system, which I won't get into detail about today, but we have work underway around infrastructure funding and financing, because it's all very well to open up the land, of course, but you've got to sort out the infrastructure challenges as well. And so we have a whole regime coming this year. We'll have more to say about this in due course around moving to a development levy system away from development contributions, which tend to under-recover the costs of infrastructure, so a much more flexible approach to the funding of infrastructure at a local level and more private sector provision of infrastructure as well. So we'll have a lot more to say about that this year, but we've spent a considerable amount of time over the last 2 years looking at and trying to fix the fundamentals of why housing is expensive in New Zealand. This is part of the solution, as I said in the opening remarks. It's not the be-all and end-all, it's not a silver bullet, but it will be an option for people, for workers, for senior New Zealanders, for people just who have a bit of extra land and they can put put a property on, rent it out, provide greater options for people. There's any number of different scenarios, and of course it's ultimately over to New Zealanders to take advantage of the opportunities, and I think many will. In fact, many have already.
And just on the freeing up land,
Yep.
in one of your housing, going for growth, housing PRs right before Christmas, you mentioned the rural-urban boundaries. So
Yes.
is it still your intention to scrap Auckland's urban-rural boundary, and when would we likely see moves on that?
Yeah, so rural-urban boundaries won't be a feature of the new planning system, so that's part and parcel of the resource management reforms we introduced before Christmas. So the intention through that is to not allow councils to draw essentially rings around their cities and say you can build here but you can't build here. And so the intention is to provide for a liberal approach to land supply, as I said. And there's a degree of complexity around that, but the intention is to not have those quite hard rural-urban boundaries. The Auckland one's been softened a bit in recent years anyway, but the intention is to not have that.
Just completely scrap it this year, or what are the next steps for that?
It'll be, and we've got to get the legislation passed, midway through this year, and then there's a 3-year transition into the new planning system. So I don't want to give you a number. I don't want to give you a date right now off the top of my head that would be inaccurate. So it'll be at some point in the next 2 to 3 years as part of the new planning system.
But that's quite a thorny issue up here in Auckland. I think the mayor in particular is more in favour of intensification rather than spread. So does that mean that all of that pressure is then going to be put on councils and ratepayers to get the infrastructure out to those new green
No,
developments?
what we're trying to build, and I agree with the mayor on this, what we're trying to do is create a planning system where the economics of the development drive what happens rather than the planning system. So greenfields housing is completely fine and a really legitimate option for people, where the infrastructure costs as a result of that greenfield housing can be recovered and they can be internalised to the cost of that development. Where people get worked up about greenfields is when existing ratepayers are forced to pay higher rates to cross-subsidise the new infrastructure required to support that greenfield housing. So if you ask Wayne about it, he would say, look, I'm not in favour of this and that because, I've got to go back to my existing ratepayers, my council, and say, I've got to hike the rates up to cross-subsidise, local roads or local infrastructure out there to support, something far off from the far reaches of Auckland. Completely understand that. That's legitimate. The planning and infrastructure system we are building will require the extra costs of growth to fall on the beneficiaries of that growth. So that's what we mean when we say we're building a planning system where growth pays for growth. Okay, and so once you have a greenfields development where the growth costs are recovered by the beneficiaries, i.e. the new residents of that development, they cover those costs, and existing ratepayers are not asked to stump up more, then there's no real objection to it. And if the economics of that development don't work without a subsidy, then that probably shouldn't be happening. That's Wayne's point. That's also my point. So we actually agree, we're building a planning system that will make it easier for his views to be reflected in the law and my views. So it's all good.
Right, so any house sold in a greenfields development will have to make sure that it recovers the cost of the infrastructure.
Yeah, so that's part and parcel of the development levy system that we're also building this year, right? So it's going to allow councils more flexibility to set levies based on. It gets very complicated, very technical, very quickly, but levies based on the costs of the infrastructure in a particular zone or in a particular area. Obviously, some areas are higher cost than others. Out here, the infrastructure costs are higher than, for example, parts of inner city Auckland, for example, because you've just got fewer people, and so the costs are higher. And also, you're building kind of fresh new infrastructure often. So there's different areas where the cost structures are differ, and so the levy zone proposal we're talking about will allow those costs to be recovered in a more economically efficient way. There'll be regulation over the top of that through the Commerce Commission. We're consulting on all of that stuff right now, and we're intending to introduce legislation for that this year.
And just from my understanding, the resource consent that you would have had to get previous to this change,
Yes.
or it's like a granny flat, does that include all of the plumbing and stuff, or is that something you have to do separately? Just for people who don't understand.
Well, it's more building. Do you want to?
Yeah, thanks. So plumbing is part of the work that won't need a building consent because it's the physical structure that's being built. But actually, as it happens, we're doing a separate piece of work that connects with this, whereby registered qualified plumbers and drain layers won't need to get a building consent or equivalent for that work. They'll be able to sign that off themselves, provided they meet all the criteria, and it's a simple bit of plumbing as defined, and that matches with the existing regime for electricians and gas fitters who are already able to certify their work. From a council's point of view, if they don't have the specialist technical experts to come in and sign off that work, it doesn't really add a lot of value. It simply adds responsibility and liability from a ratepayer point of view. So as part of the granny flat policy that's now in effect, while a lot of the discussion today has rightly been about reducing costs for those who are doing the building and of course owner-occupiers, it's also things more straightforward from a council point of view in terms of the liability and the responsibility not always falling on their shoulders.